Hi everyone, thank you for coming to Designing for Wellbeing. I hope you had a chance to grab some food in the next room over. And if you haven't had a chance to grab some food, feel free to stand up and get some, pretty informal. My name is Corinne Bemis. I am the Assistant Social Chair for the Planning Student Organization, which is an event on campus dedicated to the professional educational development of planning students at the Humphrey School. This event is part of a series called Building Health, which is a graduate student-run event series intended to facilitate interdisciplinary knowledge exchange across city-making disciplines so that we can all build a better, healthier, more sustainable city. I want to give a quick thank you to the Institute on the Environment for sponsoring us with their mini grant program, Carissa Slaughterback for being our faculty sponsor, and APA Minnesota for helping us get CM credits. I also want to give a quick shout out to Megan McSorley, who wasn't able to be here today, but was an integral part to planning this event. There are 2 APA credits available today, and so in order to be eligible for those, you must sign in, stay for the full event, and then fill out an evaluation form, which you will find on your table. If you run out of evaluation forms and more people need them, they're also going to be available on our website after the event, so don't worry about it if you aren't able to fill one out today. We will be recording today's event, and we'll send out emails and stuff when that recording is available. Yeah, from here I'll introduce our facilitator, Chris DeRoche, and then he will tell you a little bit about our panelists, our topic, and get the ball rolling with our content. So Chris will look familiar to many of you as he facilitated the CAB's conversation last fall. As a reminder, he is a second-year MERP student, an urban designer at the Musicant Group, and the vice president of the Kingfield Neighborhood Association Board. Chris also runs Echo Consulting, a design and community engagement consulting firm focusing on park and public space projects. Chris has over 10 years of experience in design, construction, engagement, and management. Awesome. I'll let Chris take over from here. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, and I'll just repeat, can everyone hear us okay? If you can't hear anybody, just raise your hand and we'll maybe pick up the mics or do something that way, but it's difficult to tell if you guys in the back can hear us. So if you can't hear, please let us know and we'll move from there. So thanks everyone for coming. I think this is our biggest event so far, so it's great that you're all here. The format that we're going to be working through, obviously we have a group of panelists here. We're going to kind of be having an open discussion, and then what we're going to do at the end is open up that discussion to questions. So please hold your questions until the end, and then we will make sure that we get to them. So I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll jump into discussion. Mary Jo Kreitzer. Mary Jo Kreitzer is the founder and director of the Earl Bachman Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota, where she serves as a tenured professor in the School of Nursing. Within the School of Nursing, Dr. Kreitzer is the co-lead of the Doctorate of Nursing Practice program in integrated health and healing. She has served as the principal investigator or co-principal investigator of numerous clinical trials, focusing on mindful meditation with persons with chronic disease. Current studies include the role of mindfulness in improving human brain-computer interface, the use of social technology to enhance healing and well-being, nursing leadership in integrated health and healing, and mindful movement for physical activity and well-being in older adults. She has authored more than 150 publications and is the co-editor of the text Integrated Health First and Second Editions. Dr. Kreitzer earned her doctorate degree in public health focused on health services, research, policy and administration, and her master's and bachelor's degree in nursing. Welcome. Let's skip to Jess over here. Jess Roberts is a self-defined unexpert in the world full of protected silos. Mr. Roberts uses his training in design to drive cross-sector radical collaborations that yield better health for all communities, especially those not served well by our current systems. Mr. Robert leads the Culture of Health by Design initiative, an initiative at the Minnesota Design Center. In his role, Mr. Roberts offers guidance, applied learning, and ongoing support for health organizations, government agencies, nonprofits, and communities looking to build practice and embed a competency and structure for design thinking, involving empathetic engagement, radical collaboration, and rapid prototyping. Roberts holds a BS and master's degree in architecture from the University of Minnesota and is currently an affiliate faculty at the School of Nursing and a professor at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, where he leads the development and delivery of a cross-disciplinary design thinking curriculum. Kristen Robb, Kristen Robb has directed the Minnesota Climate and Health Program at the Minnesota Department of Health since its inception in 2009. She has led and provided technical assistance on a number of health impact assessments in Minnesota and other states that examine how the built environment and policies influence health. In 2017, she received the Harvey G. Rogers Memorial Award from the Minnesota Public Health Association for her work on climate change. Ms. Robb has master's degree in public health and landscape architecture. Ms. Robb is passionate about creating healthy, resilient communities through health impact assessments, informed design, and policy changes. Professor Yingling Fan. Yingling Fan is a professor of urban and regional planning and director of the Global Transit Innovations Program at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on developing novel land use and transportation solutions for improving public health and social equity. She is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Transport and Land Use and the North American editor of the Urban Studies Journal. Okay, that was a lot. That was the part I was most nervous about. Was getting through. We're good. It's all uphill from here. Okay, so welcome, panelists. Well, with that said, I'm really excited to be here to talk about space design and well-being. Researchers, designers, and professionals have known for a long time that space affects people. We all experience how spaces affect on us. So how do you feel in this room right now? How is the lighting? And how does this compare to the spaces you feel the best in and the spaces you feel the worst in? The fact that people exist in spaces and that those spaces affect their well-being has often been ignored or deprioritized in pursuit of efficiency, ease of maintenance, rubber stamp design, or trending architectural aesthetics. But recently there's been a rebirth in both the design and planning world and popular culture in the cognitive, emotional, and physical effects design and space have on us. Terms like placemaking, human-scale design, human-scale mobility are popping up more and more in planning and implementation processes. We have always known that the design of space in cities affects our well-being and health. But the question to our panelists today is how do we prioritize that fact and actively work towards improving our spaces and cities to promote well-being? So I think a good kind of kickoff to this discussion is Dr. Mr. Joe and kind of coming at it in defining well-being. So based on your research and experience, can you give us a quick overview of what well-being actually means and what determines the well-being?
All right. Sure, Chris. I'm happy to do that, and let me know if you don't hear me. So well-being is a huge topic, and I'm really excited to talk about well-being because you can look at well-being at many levels. You can look at it at the level of the person, your own personal well-being. As I talk about determinants of well-being, I invite you to do that. Think about how does this describe or sound like me. You can also think of well-being at the organizational level, and you can also think of it at the community level and actually even at the environmental planetary level. And so as I go talking about well-being, I'll kind of at different times go up and kind of talk about applications in different ways. So a lot of people think health and well-being are synonymous, and they're related, but they aren't the same. But health is a really important dimension of health. And when I think of health, I think of all aspects of health: physical health, emotional health, spiritual health, psychological health. What we know that a lot of people find amazing is that 80 to 90% of how healthy people are has nothing to do with the healthcare system, nothing to do with hospitals, healthcare providers, or drugs. It has to do with lifestyle choices that people make. So what people eat, how much they move, how well they sleep, and how they manage their stress are huge determinants of their well-being. So thinking about health, I'm going to sort of share with you a key principle of behavior change that has huge implications for design. And that is the behavior change principle: make it easy to do the right thing and hard to do the wrong thing. And that's huge. So if we want to create cities where people walk and can be outside, how do we design spaces? If we want people to eat in a more healthy way, how do we make food accessible? So lots of ripple effects you can see from applying that behavior change principle. Well, I'm not going to go in deep detail, just taking one of those aspects of healthy eating. I think you can imagine how the choices we make and the food we eat has huge implications for planetary health. So if people engage in a plant-forward diet, that has big implications beyond. So health is one factor. The next factor is the whole area of purpose, and purpose is very connected to well-being. As humans, we have an innate, deep need for purpose in our life, and so I think of purpose as meaning, connectedness. And so people at every age and stage of life, this is important. For seniors over the age of 60, a study was done, and people that, over 6,000 people, and people that didn't have purpose in their life were at a 15% higher risk of death. So, how do we create spaces? How do we create communities in our own lives? How do we create space to make sure that what we are doing is aligned, with a sense of purpose? The third area of well-being is the area of relationships. And people have a deep need for human connection and relationships. So think about in your own life. People need to have people they can turn to when they're happy, when they're sad, when they have matters of the head, matters of the heart. In the United States, right now, there is more loneliness than depression. And we know that there's a huge issue with depression, but the fact that people are lonely has big implications. And the health risks of being alone are comparable to the health risks of things like diabetes, high blood pressure, other forms of heart disease. So really important to think about, how do we help people, nurture relationships in their lives. So health, purpose, relationships. The next area is community. And community in so many ways nurtures and sustains us. And when I think of community and well-being, you can think of things like roads and bridges and access to technology as aspects of well-being. But there's another aspect that's really important around community, and that is, are people engaged in the community? And beyond engagement, do they feel empowered in their community to take action? And so I sometimes share quickly the example in Whidbey Island off the coast of Seattle. A group of women became really concerned about who beats homeless teenagers on weekends. And what they did to sort of solve that issue is they actually started to make available healthy, local, organic food without any needs testing or ideology testing. The initiative is called Whidbey Island Nourishes. And what they discovered that was shocking is they had a much bigger problem than they ever imagined, so they had to really grow a big network. But to me, it's such a powerful example of people identifying a social problem and coming up themselves with a solution. So I sometimes say it doesn't always take an act of Congress to make impactful change in a community. So the next area of well-being is safety and security. And when you think of safety and security, you can think of things like people have to have enough financial resources that they can have food on the table and a roof over their heads. But actually, it's much more than that. If people have fear for any reason, it erodes their well-being. So if they live in a community where there's violence, or in a neighborhood where there's violence, or if they have fear of interpersonal violence, that erodes their well-being. And then the final area that I'll mention is the whole area of the environment. And when I think of environment, you can think of things like clean air, clean water, not having toxins. But the environment is so much more. The whole built environment has a huge impact on our well-being. And it's really exciting to talk with a group of people that know that. That is, Winston Churchill used to say, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And so huge implications. So built environment is part of environment and well-being, but so is access to nature. And that is a huge growing topic. People so recognize that there's such a connection between nature and well-being. That's true not only for kids, but for adults as well. So I'm excited to think of planners and designers considering all of these aspects of well-being as they create space.
Great, thank you so much. So I think a lot of the research that Professor Fan has worked on is around emotional well-being. Can you kind of expand on emotional well-being and how that kind of ties into the kind of spaces and so forth?
Sure. So I look at the well-being actually from the perspective, typically, broadly speaking, that well-being can be, there are two broad categories. One is the cognitive well-being, whether you're satisfied with your life, so globally, are you happy with your health? Are you happy with your job? Right? Do you have job satisfaction? But the second category, broad category that a lot of psychology researchers look at is emotional well-being. And it's very interesting because in early 1990s, this new field of positive psychology actually were emerged because psychology research traditionally focus on negative emotions, anger, anxiety, negative emotions, and because a lot of those negative emotions contribute to mental illness, and it's important to cure mental illness. But what's very exciting, I think, in psychology is that in this early 1990s, that people, important psychology researchers realized that it's also very important to study positive emotions. And here I have a model, conceptual model, which is called the broaden and build theory of positive emotions, and was developed by Barbara Fredrickson, a researcher at UMC Chapel Hill. And her idea is that positive emotion, such as happiness, is not. Yes, it is kind of time dynamic. You may be happy at this moment, and you may not be happy at next moment. It's not only an indicator of the well-being, it actually is a contributor to your long-term well-being. So basically, I think that it's related to Mary Jo's kind of statement. That is, when you are happy, you tend to have you're more likely to pick up the phone, talk to your parents. You're more likely to expand your social network. More likely to go outside, take a walk, right? And happen to see your neighbors. Okay, so when you have those positive emotions and which affects your behavior, and that those behavior change will help you to build. So there is this broadening effect, but also there is this building effect. So will help you to build personal resources. Right? Your relationship with your family and friends becomes stronger, right? You got to know more neighbors, right? You have conversations. Those conversations will be helpful for your job situation. Now, even so then this building effect essentially help you to enhance health, survival, and fulfillment. And then most importantly, the positive feedback loop. So when you build more personal resources, enjoy health fulfillment, you're more likely to have positive emotions. Okay, so it's a positive feedback loop. And I can also talk a little bit about my own research, what did I find in terms of how transportation infrastructure can shape people's positive emotions. So I wanted to do a small experiment.
Yeah.
That's okay with everybody. So when we are happy, what we typically do.
Smile.
So now research has shown that even if you just don't feel the urge to smile at the moment, but if you have a pencil and you kind of have your pencil between your teeth and make that smile, you also feel a little bit of happiness, positive emotions inside. So the experiment I have is that why don't you turn to your neighbor at the table and just smile.
That's probably the goal.
You could just smile. So this is an example of how our behavior actually shapes our emotions. Okay. So as an urban planner, we have many opportunities to shape people's behavior because the built environment shapes people's behavior. So there is this. So psychologists already built this link between emotion and health, long-term health, and personal development, human development. Now, as an urban planner, we understand the relationship between the built environment and behavior. So now we can make the connection from built environment behavior to health, to long-term well-being. So my own research, I'm particularly interested in how transportation systems affects people's health and well-being. And very kind of fortunate that there is this survey, national survey called the American Time Use Survey. And the American Time Use Survey actually asked people, how did you feel during specific activities and specific trips? So I was able to use the American Time Use Survey, a national survey, to look at how does happiness vary across triple categories. Biking is the happiest mode. But nationally, our biking percentage is lower than 5%. We have a lot to do, right? As a urban planner. Longer commute is associated with unhappiness. So can we? I know that we know that we have urban sprawl. We don't have job balance. A lot of our neighborhoods are not fixed use, right? So we have long travel distances and result in long, times stuck in traffic, right? That may lead to unhappiness. So those are just the two simplest examples of how, as urban planners, how we can shape the emotional well-being.
That's great. And you can see how quickly people's emotions changing in a space changes the space and changes the dynamic of the space, that's a great great experiment. So I'll jump to Jess. Jess done a lot of work on design thinking and design thinking processes. So what does design thinking and human-centered design bring to the conversation around public health? And how does it differ and complement traditional public health practice?
I'm a trained architect. Fisher here was the dean of the College of Science. I'm a gopher. And it's a 3-year master's degree, and I think a lot of people think of design as this really technical thing, right? You just do drawings. Well, it wouldn't take that long to learn to draw. And in practice, it did become this technical thing, and one of the things that really bothered me about design was you were sort of like the last person to touch these interventions, which are building, community design, et cetera, where all the policies and ordinances and regulations all were dictating what we were doing to a degree. It was really difficult to utilize the design process because everything decided is designed, right? So I started to move into the healthcare space and looking at design as a process of making decisions, making policy, creating programs and initiatives, but doing so in a way that has a bit more rigor. So design brings to more traditional, public health, we do a lot of research, right? So we know that obesity is a problem. We have more information now than at any other point in human history that obesity is problematic. And yet, as a species, we have a higher percentage of obesity than at any other point in our existence. So knowledge and impact do not equate. And part of that is because research is inherently reflective, right? It has to have happened, and we need to understand how we got here. So that's a good start point. But design is a bit more about asking what could be, right? It's sort of now that we understand this is a problem, right? What could be? And understanding, we have all this data that's sort of abstractions of reality. What does it actually look and feel like for people living these things? So in design, you're always connected with users, right? You have clients. In architecture, you would literally get a blank slate, a blank site. You had to sort of propose a future state. And then more importantly, sort of walk through a process, an iterative process to get from what you think that future state might look like, but then incorporate all the community input, the client's input, changes because of mechanical or electrical engineers. Well, we now just apply the same thing in the public health space. I would argue that the biggest threat to health is not a lack of resources or willingness to change. It's a chronic lack of creativity. And that's what design really brings, because we keep approaching the same problems in the same way with the same people and expecting different outcomes. Working in healthcare, that's all we do, primarily, right? And that hasn't led us to the breakthroughs we had hoped. And unfortunately, most of the breakthroughs in healthcare tend to exacerbate the disparities we see in things like health and education, et cetera. So the real complement to design is this sort of upstream process for creating potentially entirely new hypotheses that are more grounded in the lived realities of people living these things. So it really is this emphasis on problem. So it's more problem solving. It's sort of a problem solving process, but I would argue it's primarily a problem framing exercise because the problems matter more than probably anything else. In fact, if you look at most breakthroughs in human history, it's because it's not the result of a new idea. It's the result of a new way of thinking about the problem. That's where the breakthroughs occur. The best way to get to new outcomes is to start from a different start point. And too often we just keep returning, right? Well, obesity is calories in, calories out. And then what does that promote? Well, it promotes, I need to educate you, right? I need to educate people, and that they'll just know then that, they'll make these different decisions. Well, there's so much that influence our day-to-day lives, or isolation, right? You should be isolated. Well, there's reasons why that happens, right? Interestingly enough, a report came out earlier this year that showed the number one most isolated, and some surveyed, isolated segment of the population is college-age adults, which I found really a bit shocking. You think about elderly, but it's college-age adults. And so the problem matters because we confuse complicated with complex, right? And we've lived in the complicated space for a long time. That's the space and the domain of expertise. Because there's a right answer. We just put enough expertise on it and they'll figure it out. There's a right answer that will come from that. But when we're talking about obesity, isolation, disparities, those are complex problems. And complex problems do not have a right answer. In fact, your variables are always changing. So there isn't a static right answer. That's the domain of emergence, and that's what the design process, more than anything, is valuable for. It brings that iterative process and puts the people most affected in the driver's seat. Because part of the problem with decision making is it's a gatekeeping activity. And even if you get sort of insights from a population, you're not living it. You don't know what this is like on a day-to-day basis, and decisions, you filter the decision-making process in a way that can actually enhance things like disparity. So in the design work, we primarily look to facilitate what we call studio culture. So anyone that's been in design knows what the studio culture is. It's this framework for iteratively working through problems and getting input, and that's where going back to the drawing board came from. It's just continuously working through emerging ideas that you didn't have going in, but are far superior to anything you could have proposed beforehand. And so we just look to apply that to issues of public health, not just the built environment, not just coming up with a particular artifact at the end of the process.
That's great, thanks. So I guess framing the question to Kristen around kind of problems and what problems, how do you feel your work around therapeutic landscape? What problems do you feel therapeutic landscapes kind of either solve for or are working towards kind of that?
Right, so I actually want to back up this a little bit. So I've done some work around therapeutic landscapes, and there's quite a lot of research in this area, and there are critical factors that you think about when you're designing therapeutic landscapes. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the problems that were just approached by panelists here. And some of those are really system problems. So we're talking about design, we're talking about the environment. And those are things that a lot of the people in this room have a lot of actually control over. So you've got planners in this room, you've got architects, you've got landscape architects, you have all of these disciplines here that have a lot of control about how cities get built, how communities are designed. All of those things have a lot of power around how we live our lives. And so, when we're talking, once you get down to the site level, some decisions have already been made. Planners are making some of those decisions, government officials are making some of those decisions. But I wanted to kind of bring to your attention a tool that it probably includes some design thinking within it, which is called a health impact assessment. So that is a tool that we've used, and even some people in this room have used, to look at policies that, like transportation policies or area plans or all sorts of kinds from very project-oriented types of plans to very high-level policies, even educational policies, a whole bunch of environmental justice policies. Anyway, it is a tool that you can use to look at all of these different kinds of policies and plans and think about health, because when I know that the transportation, like MnDOT, for example, is starting to think a little bit more critically about how the design of our highways, et cetera, impact health. But for a long time, a lot of those decisions and design moves were made without thinking about what that impact is on people. So for example, with highways, it's sort of like, how do you get the most people from point A to point B safely and as fast as possible? Not thinking about what is the context. Are we in a community? Do we want people to be stopping there and shopping there and being part of the community, slowing down, all of these types of things. Anyway, a health impact assessment is a process that you can use to look at a whole level of different kinds of projects and policies, and then also provide information to decision makers so that they can make a better decision. So if you're interested in health impact assessments, please see me, but we also have a whole bunch of information on the Minnesota Department of Health website. So I just wanted to share that with you, because I think a lot of the issues that we experience are actually system issues. They're not necessarily, the environment drives that, but also the policies that we make drive that. So the more that we can think about health within those policies, the more likely it is we're going to have healthier environments.
That's really good. What do you think overall is holding us back, or has held us back in the past from thinking about health as part of this kind of system or policy?
Well, I guess I just think that for a long time, and this is very true of the planning field, planning and public health used to be like inseparable. They used to be together. And then as these fields have been more defined and become more siloed, and so there's experts in planning, and there's experts in public health, and there's experts in architecture. And for a long time, they were really siloed, and they didn't see the commonalities, and they didn't see how they can work better together to solve, bring solutions to the table. But I think a lot of those barriers are breaking down now. I think there's a lot of interest in how all of these disciplines can work together to promote health. So I feel like there's been a lot of growth in this area, and even at the University of Minnesota. So I think it's a really exciting time, and I think that the people that are in this room that are soon to be designers, that are soon to be planners, have a lot of power in how we shape the future of our environments and our policies.
So I think I'll just add a little bit to that. So I think, when we started looking at environmental impact, that was a huge sort of shift in perspective and thinking about, not only what's convenient, but what's the impact on the environment. I think shifting to a wellness or even a health or even a well-being impact is kind of a shift beyond. And so I think kind of having, sort of thinking of that being a lens, well-being, is huge. And I was looking on my phone because I found it so interesting at the World Economic Forum in Davos. So just a week ago, I took a snapshot of this. New Zealand wants to transform its politics to focus on kindness, empathy, and well-being. And more and more nations are actually establishing well-being indices. So now there's a lot of focus on looking at economic indicators. and creating economic hope. How huge that's going to be if countries come up with well-being indices, and that those well-being indices then really drive policy.
Yeah, I think sort of this industrial model we still live in, which is the expertise, you become expert on a very particular subset of activities, and then you sort of hand it off, and we just sort of, if we get all the parts right, we'll have a really great end product. Well, that's not recognizing that all of these things are in these sort of ecosystems. Our health or lack thereof is this ecosystem of, dynamic influences. So I think that's one of them. I think the other thing is our business models we build because of that. Right? As an architect, we are not, I would never go in to meet with a client and ask what you need and is a building really going to do this for you, right? Because that's how I make my money. I have to build something, even if building something is not the right solution. And I did some work with a local health system last year that was 4 years into planning for this large sort of MIC clinic system. And the target was young mothers and adolescents, because that's sort of a missed opportunity in the current health system. So 4 years in, and the sort of market research they had done and spent millions of dollars already in this planning process was, I offer some archetypes, right? Some design archetypes of different types of clinic spaces. Well, if I'm given the opportunity to pick one, yeah, I can pick one, but it wasn't even asking the question of what are these clinics doing for you? And so I spent 2 months, and actually went out and talked to young mothers because I hadn't done that yet, right? 4 years into planning, they had never talked to the patients because a 70-year-old white male physician knew what young millennial moms would need right now, right? And number one, no one's asking for a clinic. In fact, they're asking for very much the opposite. Anyone that has kids realizes the very last place you want to go is a clinic, particularly if you have to drag your healthy kids with you. So that's number one. Number two, the sort of intervention was moms want to be, they want the spa treatment when they come to a clinic. So valet parking and tea in the waiting room and robes in the exam room. Like, no one goes to the clinic for a good time. So, no one was talking about that. And part of the shift was, if you know any mothers, if you know your mother, they didn't see themselves as patients, right? In fact, they were caregiver, their own health was, and the data shows this, 10th on the list behind the dog, right? So they didn't see themselves as patients, even though the system is designing for them as patients. Designing for caregivers looks really different than designing for patients. And then thirdly, what they really wanted for their adolescent children was a call-in, like when you have a newborn and they have 102 fever and you think they're dying, because the nurse hotline, they'll normalize it, like this is normal, babies have this, here's what to do, and here's what to look out for. They want the same thing with pubescent children, right? Because I don't know if it's mental illness or puberty, because those things are really intertwined. So those are the things they were asking for, none of which would be delivered by the clinic. So in 2 months' time of really small investment of just engaging real people and their lived experience, after 4 years of planning, they terminated the project and saved millions of dollars, because it was more about design should be more about what you shouldn't be doing than what you should. So I think that's a fundamental flaw as well, because we get paid. If I was in the architecture role, that's not my business model. I need to build that, tens of thousands of square foot clinic.
I think you raise a really good point in that better decisions are made when you involve the community or those people that are being impacted. So that was an excellent example of going out and talking to the patients about what they needed. And I think a lot of design, planning, can make better decisions as you involve those people that are being impacted. So I think that's really important. That's really important when you're talking about disparities as well, to bring people that may not have traditionally had a voice in those decisions or in that design, and bring them to the table because they always bring really good information. They bring things that you never even thought about what either the issues are or about what some of the solutions are. You know, communities can be incredibly powerful. They have a lot of assets. As someone that may not live in the community that you're either planning for or designing, you may not know what those things are. So it's really important that engagement is how you can really create better, healthier places.
Yeah, I want to second that. I think community engagement, and especially when it comes to addressing health disparities, because my observation is that when not designed appropriately or planned properly, actually designers and planners could create intentionally underclass. An experience I had is that I don't know how many of you have been to Arlington, Texas. So Arlington, Texas is a very unique city in the United States. Before 2013, there was no public transportation. Okay, so the city just decided to not invest in public transportation. So you can, when I visited, it was 2016, they had one bus line linking, had 2 stops, I think, 1 bus line, 2 stops. And the city is actually, itself, if you look at the citywide population density, is actually denser, denser than Dallas, city of Dallas. If you look at it, it's one of the densest suburban city in the United States. So what's interesting is that, when I went to the city, typically when I do my field work, I will go into the city hall because city hall is a great place to look for public information, whether there is a public hearing about specific there are projects going on in this particular city. So I went in, I see a human sculpture, okay, human-shaped sculpture, and because when I do field work, I typically walk. Right? I go into the front door, I see a human shaped sculpture, but the human shaped sculpture isn't facing me. So as if he is turned back to me, right? Or turned back on me. So I was like, why would they place a human shaped sculpture at the back? Have the back facing the front door. And then I realized because most people coming in through the back door from the parking lot. So I felt like, I think that was the moment where, kind of like when 90% of the United States people actually drive a car. And we effectively created underclass. How people with car cars, what kind of, do they feel excluded? Because that a lot of our design and planning actually is focused on those who have cars. Anyway, so that's a story to share. I think it was a very interesting moment.
No, that's really interesting. I think community engagement and engaging with communities and empathy in the design process is a really interesting part of this discussion. I guess, is there any other specific examples? Jesse has really good examples out of healthcare, or examples or even best practices in engaging populations to help them facilitate well-being, whether it's in transportation or whether it's in landscapes or whether it's in other spaces.
This isn't necessarily an example, but I do feel that the future of design and planning is really about empowering communities to make their own decisions and design moves. So for a long time, design has really been about the designer who solves all the problems. And that just seems really archaic to me now, that design and planning, healthcare, all of those things are really about facilitating a conversation amongst the community members that are being impacted by whatever it is that you're proposing, a policy or a design plan. It's really about actually giving your power or the institution's power up and empowering the community to bring those decisions and those design moves, because we don't have all the solutions, we're not part of the community. These are community decisions, they should be made by the community, and I think that is really the way of the future. It's not so much that we're like the knowledge bearers, that we're there to help facilitate that conversation, to have different ideas and choices rise from the community so that the best decisions can be made for the community and by the community. And that's a really different way of thinking about design and policy making than we have before. It's always been sort of top down. It really needs to go from bottom up.
Yeah, I think that's, so a lot of increasingly the work we're doing, and Tom's part of that, is how do you facilitate that? Because traditionally community engagement's been this pretty empty activity, right? It's sort of, we'll put on a community event and then invite people, right? And it's you either tell us what idea you like or whether or not you like this idea, so it's already giving you something with huge amount of assumption built in. Or we ask you what the problems are and ideas you might have for addressing them, which if it was that easy, you wouldn't need to have that meeting in the first place. And then thirdly, those are your super users. They're people that can show up, they can speak your language, they feel comfortable, they have access, because it's usually like during business hours to come and engage in this way. And that's what healthcare has done, right? They have patient advisory committees, but they're just basically people who are as like us as possible. They can speak the lingo, sort of tell us what we want to hear. So what we've been really trying to be intentional about is designer as facilitator. So how do you facilitate design and not actually be the designer? And so we have a couple grants where we're creating studios. Right? Again, people who are familiar with design, we're creating studios with communities. So they walk through literally the design process. They're citizen designers. It may not look or feel like we thought it might. And we're there to primarily just prompt questions, not offer answers, because again, there isn't a singular answer here. And I think a really great project that we're just starting that's McKnight funded is looking at the future of planning through the lens of younger people. So the people who will actually need to inhabit this future state probably should have some input, because I'll tell you what, it's pretty drastically different, the expectations, than most of those that are in the decision-making space. And so we're actually creating numerous studios. One studio is younger folks from high school grads up through about 30. We have another one with developers, and then another one with community leaders, mayors of the region. And then looking individually, how do their ideas or perspectives align or not? Because younger people see community incredibly different than, boomers, because community is not actually geographic at all for most young people. And then you bring them together to work through that, not to convince one another that there's a right side or a wrong side, but you use sort of those start points, those tensions, as the space for design. Okay, if this is how we understand community, how does our design process, decision-making process better reflect that? And there's no shortcut for bringing them together, because you lose something when it's digital or communication strategy. It has to happen together, repeated over time in this iterative fashion, and you have to pay them. Community can't just be volunteers. If they're going to be designers, you have to pay them because they're providing a service, just like you're there because you're getting paid.
Just build, Kristen, on your comment, it's a huge shift to go from being expert to facilitator. And so I think even in the educational process, be teaching people that whole idea and that whole process. And that's not only happening in the design world, it's also happening in healthcare. And there's also often this generational shift, because a lot of healthcare providers have been trained to know the answers, to tell people what to do. And it's a whole new idea to ask you what's important to you and how do I support you with your goals. And that's why even the whole new career in health coaching is emerging. And health coaches are different than health educators who tell people what to do. Health coaches essentially say, what are your goals and how can I help you remove the barriers to those goals. So that's a major shift that from experts and facilitators.
Do you see, we've kind of been talking about engagement and community engagement in terms of like its outcomes, right? Or being applied to improve outcomes, improve design processes. Do you see any benefits to the individual or the community in terms of well-being in actually participating? Like how does a participant who comes and engages and is actively engaged, how is their well-being better in that moment or as they move forward in other engagement?
So a lot of the processes I've been involved with around health impact assessments and bringing community into the table and empowering them really to make their own decisions. And so part of that is this feeling of having control over either your space or those decisions. That's a really powerful psychological aspect of being healthy and feeling good about yourself is really feeling, I think it's locus of control, being able to control your destiny, your environment, whatever. But it's not just that piece. There's also the social component of meeting your neighbors or people you didn't know. So there's this whole piece of developing different networks, building relationships. That's also a really important part, as Mary Jo was talking about, to your well-being, is knowing more people, having greater networks. So I think there's like multiple layers of participating in that process that is actually, quite helpful. So.
Cool. Well, I think maybe let's drill down into kind of physical space a little bit and kind of talk a little bit about what are some components of a healthy neighborhood, a healthy space, a healthy city, and how does that vary depending on scale? So does a healthy space block have the same kind of components as a healthy city or a healthy household? And what are some specific architectural and landscape components that appear to be critical to kind of healthy space?
Well, I'm sure all of you are really intimately familiar with a lot of those kind of design things, like walkable communities, green spaces where people can gather, where they can have access to nature. There's just books and books and books written about these kinds of things. One of the things that I did when I was getting my master's in landscape architecture here was work on therapeutic gardens. And so some of the research around that, looking at some researchers from Michigan, there were Kaplan and Kaplan, they came up with 4 criteria for healing spaces. One is fascination, so it's this idea of when you're out in an environment, like you're walking in the woods, you're hearing the birds, or you're hearing wind through the trees, and you're smelling like the pine needles, or you're kind of being engaged with all your senses, but you're not really focused like you are when you're studying for your exam. That's called directed attention. You're like working really hard and paying attention. When you're out in the woods, you're able to do what they call sort of soft attention. And so that gives you this opportunity for your part of your brain to take a break. It allows you to sort of relax and enjoy that space and kind of get some restoration. Another component is feeling like you're away from your problems or away from your daily spaces. You feel like you've gotten away. That's why we go on vacations. We just need to get away. Another component is called extent, and that is this idea of being in a space where you kind of navigate the area, but you feel like it kind of continues on. So, it's like when you're walking a winding path, you can't really see quite what there's a little bit of intrigue and interest, but you're connected to the whole. And the other component they talk about is compatibility. And that is the idea that the space offers you the types of things that you want to do. Meaning, I'm really tired, I want to sit down. Okay, so there's to like architectural details like a bench, or I really want to walk, there's interesting paths. That's kind of what they talk about. But in addition to that, when I was doing my research for my capstone project, I came through quite a few other important components. And one was safety. You really need to feel safe in a place to be able to relax and heal. Another is having like biological cues for your circadian rhythm. So things like the leaves changing, for example, oh, we're in fall, or maybe the light is changed slightly because it's getting darker and so it's softer light. I mean, so it kind of, your body responds to these different kinds of cues. Having either sort of healing symbols or other types of things that you might associate with healing can be really powerful. It's kind of, I'm not going to say it is the placebo effect, we don't really know, but it helps. So whether it's just your belief that this is a healing symbol for you or whatever, it does help. So there's that. Ideally, it's aesthetically pleasing. And some of the ways you can do this is like introducing water. We all have a fascination with water. We're made of water. Vegetation, because it changes with the seasons. There's a lot of research just looking at trees can improve your mood. And then there's sort of design moves you can make, like enclosure for safety or thresholds to say that, oh, I'm entering into a new space here. This is a space of healing and contemplation. So there's a whole bunch of kind of like design moves you can use to try and develop these sort of kind of smaller spaces, and maybe some of them can be like extended up to more of a city level scale.
So two things strike me, Chris, from what you're talking about. One is having clarity, and the other is clear intentionality, and really being intentional about that space. And one example I can give you that was really powerful for me a few years ago, I was asked to give an address in Korea. And what I didn't realize until I sort of studied this a little bit more, Korea is about 80% forested. And this conference, it was such a unique conference. It was actually hosted by the Minister of Forestry and the Ministry of Health. And they were asking me to talk about well-being. And what they were really trying to do is think about how do they create the right kind of forest for the kind of well-being and health outcomes. And they were down to the level of studying the terpenes in the trees to actually know which kinds of forests to kind of plant where to get the impact and outcomes they want. So I think it's interesting to think of the micro things that you talked about, as well as some of these big macro pieces, and really just, again, have as principles clarity and then intentionality, and that intentionality then really drives the outcome.
I think another really interesting thing coming up with that is how well-being looks in a variety of like urban contexts. So whether it's downtown or rural or suburban, I guess, do you want to comment on that and how you see kind of maybe some of these specific design principles, or whether it's engagement happening in kind of some of these different contexts, or is it not different? Is it all the same and it needs to be treated the same because people are people and everything like that?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think, though, that all contexts are local, so I think solutions are really they should be locally based, because you have whatever different traditions, maybe a different mix of people within that community. They may have really different values. So I do think that there are some universal things, like we all need physical activity, we all need healthy food, we all need social places to socialize, places where we can connect. I mean, there's sort of universal principles per se, but the actual design solutions really are localized. I think they're really about that community and what that community needs. So that's an easy answer.
This is actually very interesting because we did the happiness research, kind of specifically focus on transportation, travel behavior, right? The vacation with happiness in U.S. cities as well as in China cities. So in Chinese cities, actually the happiest mode is car, and it's because biking is not that safe. Actually, if you look at the biking environment in Chinese cities, actually, it's not as safe even in U.S. cities. I mean, compare U.S. cities to European cities. I mean, I don't think we have good, bicycling infrastructure as good as European cities. But in China, it's very interesting that, when we look at the heavy smoke as a car, and what does it mean? Do we all driving cars, right? So one framework, and I think it's was very helpful, is this co-benefits framework. Is basically that, and it's related to Mary Jo's comment about GDP. Like now, a lot of nations do not look at the GDP per capita, but they look at the well-being index, because you can have a strong economy, but with very bad environment quality, and people are not suffering and not healthy, right? So when we apply those co-benefits framework, and then a recommendation we give to kind of government agencies in China is actually try to the reason that people think of the car is the happiest mode because it's most convenient. And it made driving most convenient in cities, in Chinese cities. So they have to strengthen their public transportation infrastructure. They have to make their cities more walkable and more micro. And it's completely different here. Where here we already what we see is that biking and walking are happiest.
I think, which was brought up previously, sort of designing in autonomy and control. And so at the micro level, that might be, they've done studies where you can put a fake thermostat on the wall and people's comfort zone grows like by double because you just think you have control over the space, which is kind of but at the macro level, it's even thinking about something like housing. What does housing look generationally? Because I can tell you whether it's because of affordability, whether it's just expectation, how people define community. Those things change pretty drastically, whether it's culturally, generationally, so that you need to sort of build in an ability to adapt to those things, because the sort of American dream in terms of housing and retirement, all these things are not the American dream of like younger people, millennials, right? Because college, retirement, healthcare, housing, transportation, all have really different, there's hugely different expectations and costs associated with that than even just the generation before them. So I think it's at the macro level, it's thinking about how communities will be able to be adapted to, because it's local, right? Health is always hyper-local and dynamic. So you can't just, that's why replication always is so difficult in the public health space, because something that works in one particular context just doesn't typically work well in others, because it was designed around very specific contextual influences. And I think that's the recognition of that, so you allow for some of that flexibility and adaptability over time is key to designing.
I just wanted to because it's also related to our research about people's park use. So what we found was very interesting is that there is this racial gap in Minneapolis in terms of the park use. So kind of white residents, their park use is actually frequency is much higher than especially African American communities. And what we found out was very interesting when we asked kind of what your preferred kind of infrastructure or in parks, and kind of location respondents often talk about trails like walking, natural components and nature components, and then African American respondents often talk about the structured activity space. So for example, basketball courts, right? Kind of structured play spaces. And what's also interesting is that sometimes, physical design, is not necessary. No, it's not enough. How to say this? It's not enough, because we also find that warm weather parties and cold weather parties, the patterns are very different. So if you look at the gap between warm weather parties and cold weather parties among Caucasian respondents, that gap exists, but not significantly large. But if you look at warm weather, the gap between warm weather parties and cold weather parties among immigrants, so people who, immigrants, for example, from Mexico, from Somalia, the gap is huge, right? So, if we think about how we use parks in cold weather, a lot of those activities require expensive equipment, such as skiing, skating, kind of like snowshoeing. Snowshoeing is not cheap. Snowshoes are not cheap. And also that it require, it's not something that you can learn by yourself easily, okay? So I think that's very interesting because sometimes you not only need to have, infrastructure, right, physical change, but you also need to have some program built in, kind of like, I think Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board was thinking about kind of like a program where, kind of people who know how to use parks in the cold weather can teach people who don't know how to use parks in the cold weather. So.
I think programming is a really thing, and I don't know if anyone else has any comments on programming in space outside of park use, like in how, is there any examples that you can think of spaces that where you could engage the community could build the space, it could be great, but the capital, the physical space isn't enough, that programming is really required in that space, or some sort of programming or maintenance is required in that space to make the space be authentic and continue to be a good space. Is there any good examples of that?
I think healthcare, right? Healthcare has changed drastically around that. The sort of programming of the space is becoming less and less a necessity, right? The face-to-face with clinicians is becoming less and less important, and you can do that, particularly when you think about rural settings where hospitals and clinics are closing. Increasingly, the virtual is really the best and only option. But it's also the recognition that, even by the data, like your yearly physical exam has no impact on your mortality. So even just the things that we've sort of built into the healthcare system really doesn't matter. And again, we talk about generationally, how we interact with healthcare system. There's huge differences in what that expectation is, and even where people go for healthcare, right? Younger folks will just use Target or Virtual far more than a traditional clinic setting. And so I think it's the programming there is around, and particularly if you're having a conversation around, what matters to you versus, a more sort of technical, physical interaction, that has huge implications. In fact, it's interesting when you think about exam room, right? Just the idea of exams signifies something, but the most important part of that interaction is a conversation you have with a clinician. 80% of their diagnostic ability is in the conversation. And yet the room is still built around the physical stuff, right? You're kind of crammed in a corner next to a computer for the conversation, which is most important. And then there's the big bed that you sit on and then kind of, okay, I've already made my diagnosis. So I think even just current state, there's a huge shift occurring in the types of spaces that you can have a conversation. Like the home is the place to have a conversation about what matters to you, not the clinic, because it's sort of like, well, what do you mean? Like, it matters to me to get rid of my sore throat versus, like, I just want to spend more time with my children or something. Those type, you can have very different conversations where you are at, right, versus coming to us, which has been the traditional clinic model.
So I think, Jess, you captured really well the shift from even in-person to virtual. There's also the shift from individual provider to teams, and now more and more it's team-based care. And the other shift, I would say, that's huge and has a big impact on space is moving things out of even the healthcare system to saying this should be community-based. And so, even not moving healthcare into Target, but moving, whether it's into churches or synagogues or faith communities or community centers or schools, there's so much more that we can do to support health and well-being in those spaces than in kind of traditional healthcare.
So I'll ask one more question, then I'll open it up to you guys, and we can open it up to questions. So I think a lot of everyone here, if you're planners, architects, working in kind of a policy field, what is one way that everyone here, or future planners, can kind of change their practice or adapt their practice to take on kind of the concept of well-being, the concept of health, and integrating that intimately into what they do on a day-to-day basis? So if you've got one, I'll start here, and we're going around.
I would just say, you start having well-being lens, that you kind of, all decision-making filters through a well-being lens. So any decision you make, what's going to be the impact on well-being? The personal well-being, the organizational, the community.
I would think about engaging the community in the decisions that you're making, whether they be design, planning, or otherwise. I think we all have really great ideas, but I think you always come to a better decision or solution when you involve more people in that, because it just brings so much more information and richness to the discussion and the solutions, that I think it's really important to engage those people that are going to be affected by whatever that plan or decision is. So I would definitely say engaging community within your work is really important.
Yeah, I would definitely say community engagement is important. I would add that have this do no harm principle, because we are very, kind of we have a lot of control in terms of how the decision is made, in terms of the environment. So if you don't have this broad perspective, sometimes our decisions could do harm to a group of, and often marginalized and disadvantaged population groups.
I'd say early, immediate sort of direct engagement with both those you sort of see as your users, but then also those you don't necessarily, because in healthcare, again, if you're just engaging the folks that already utilize your services, you only get a really narrow view, or a particular treatment. People who have gone through it and had a successful, if it's breast cancer treatment, they're going to be champions for that. But before cancer became part of their life, that's not part of the thinking. So what about those folks that are not engaging with you or the intervention, the program, the institution you're working with? Collect that information. I talked about creativity. Well, the only way you induce more creativity is not an individualized thing. We think some people are more creative than others, and that might be the case. But creativity is truly born out of diversity. You can't have creativity without diversity of opinions, perspectives, experiences, backgrounds. That's the key. And so being really intentional about that diversity of engagement up front is not just, because it's the right thing to do, which it is, but you cannot get that breakthrough, that novel thinking, those new ideas, those surprises without it. It's critical.
I think there's one more thing I'd just like to add is that when you're thinking about the work you're doing, I would be thinking about the interconnections between things, because everything's kind of related to everything else, and you make one sort of move that changes a whole lot of cascading other things. And so it's part of this do no harm, but it's also part of this really thinking about how these things interact, because if you're doing something that might actually harm the environment, it might be good for something, but then it might be bad for something else. So thinking about sort of the repercussions of the work you're doing and thinking about the connectedness, I think is really an important concept when you're thinking about your work. It's really, don't just go one step, go a few steps down to see how that might impact the work, your people that you're working with, or the environment that you're in.
Great. So I think we'll open it up for questions if you're ready, or do you want to jump ahead? There was the last slide that we had for to talk kind of specifically about some kind of like.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight two tools. There are so many more. So, but since I am from the health department, I have to highlight our tool, which is right up here. It's Minnesota Healthy Planning How-To Guide. And this talks a lot about different kinds of planning strategies or design moves you can make that have co-benefits, so different kinds of health benefits. So just by doing one thing doesn't mean that you're only solving one problem. You may be actually hitting a host of different kinds of issues. That's what this graph is about. The other piece here is from the American Planning Association. They have done a ton of work around how to plan for healthy communities. This is just one of them. It's the metrics for planning healthy communities. You'll see I just took a little chunk out of their social cohesion as part of that wellness piece. And then they actually have strategies about how you can achieve that. And I also want to mention that there are some people in this room that have done some really great work around healthy planning. And Denise, do you mind just standing up and, because she leads a group of planners within the metro area looking at how to incorporate health into comprehensive plans. And I think that's just been an amazing community and way of really improving sort of the planning within the metropolitan area.
So I think we'll open it up to questions. Are there any questions from the audience?
So one of the things that I think we don't talk enough about coming out of the design and planning community is Naomi Klein's idea that we're in a world of disaster capitalism. Basically, we have a lot of people profiting off of ill health. And we have an economy that makes it cheap and easy to have a bad diet, to be sedentary, and we make it expensive and difficult to be healthy. So how do we address market mechanisms that fix that? I mean, for example, what if there was a taxation system that was based on health effects of your products and your services rather than its market valuation or your income? In other words, it seems to me that until we deal with that idea that our capitalistic system is pushing ill health, until we address that, all the planning in the world is not going to have the kind of effect I think we hope it has. Any thoughts?
I really agree with you, and it's like finding ways to incentivize people to do the right thing. And so, other examples are putting taxes on things like soda and, cigarette taxes. I think a really perverse behavior of when schools, put in vending machines because they get money from Coca-Cola to sort of sell, junk products, to kids. So I think there's a lot of economic decisions. The whole war on cancer. I think, there's some really interesting books that are sort of written on why aren't we investing a lot more on the prevention and the environmental issues. And so it all, in my mind, is economics, but it gets back to policy that drives that. There's a really interesting book, Deborah Davis, The Secret History of the War on Cancer. And she talks a lot about how we haven't put the money into prevention. We focus so much more on treatment because we're really embedded in having all these facilities to treat people.
And I think this takes a real shift in how people think about healthcare in our economy. So the United States spends more on healthcare than any country in the world, and yet we are not number one in health. We're actually like number 27. We have life expectancy less than Japan, Sweden, a whole host of other countries. And that is because we do not put the energy and the values within things like prevention. We don't value that apparently because we don't put money into that. We put a lot of money into healthcare, but we don't put it into prevention and making sort of the right choices, the easy choices. But I do think that, all of you here are empowered to help change policies to try and mitigate some of these issues. I think there's a lot of work that you can do as planners, as engaged citizens, where you can speak out, we can make changes. There's a lot of forces that benefit from the way things are, but it's not necessarily us in this room. So I think it's really important to get engaged in those decisions and voice your concern. This is how things get changed. People get up, they start walking on the mall, They call their legislator, they vote for other people. This is how you engage in your government, it's in how you engage in the policies that sort of shape our world. And it's really important that you get engaged because that's how these things change.
I can't agree.
No, go ahead. You-
Okay, I can agree with you more because one other thing I think we needed to think, we needed to change as an urban planner, as a designer, is that a lot of times that we don't think our, the public as consumers. Because I actually think it's actually important to have that mindset that we needed to attract our consumers. I mean, think about McDonald's. They have a playground, right, in their restaurant. They name their kids' meal Happy Meals, right? So can we, as urban planners or like public sector workers, like how can we have that mindset also? Make our public parks more attractive, right? As attractive as those private parks. I mean, there are private parks, kind of like a lot of people now exercise in the fancy club, right? Not necessarily in neighborhood parks, right? How can we make those places more public places more attractive for people to spend more time in, so that the public can give us more money to maintain those places, right? It's a chicken and egg problem. So I think we also needed to have that, kind of a mindset that we need to serve our consumers. They are consumers. They have other options.
I'm probably less optimistic. Tom wrote a really great book about fracture critical systems, and I think I see things like, healthcare, public health, as the sort of fracture critical, and we're seeing the cracks. We're seeing failings of it. People don't know where to place that yet, right? Like, sort of, we'll place blame in these, interesting places that have nothing to do with it. But given the forces, given that we have an exploding aging population that's going to be drawing enormous amounts of resources, which we don't have, a shrinking workforce, like all of these forces. So I would say like the design shift is going to be really quick because we're starting to see the cracks already. And I would say, in the next decade, we will just be going down that road because we have to. And humanity has always operated that way. Like we go to the edge and then, we need to be really creative. And that's where I think the designer, the planner, the roles will be as critical as, the cardiologist when you're having a heart attack, because the existing systems will fail and we'll need to radically redesign in an instant.
Right here.
Yeah, so this is more for Jess, I guess, but for the whole group. So you mentioned millennials several times. You were talking about designing buildings for millennials, housing choices, and clinics, and talking about choice. And so when I think of millennials, I think of a white, middle class, usually college educated person, and that is a group that is here in Mass. However, people of color are the fastest growing group, in particular our immigrants and refugees. And so I'm thinking, even colleagues and the racial and health equity work that we're doing at Hennepin County, we talk about housing choices and how for an African American young couple, housing ownership is still way more important than just renting. And so, I guess I'm cautious when I think about millennials and wondering how you think of millennials and how you think of the future here in the Twin Cities and statewide. How do we really plan, and how do we divide up that group and plan for the groups that are growing the most and that really need our resources and that may have the fewest social connections and all of those things?
Yeah, so in the work that we're doing, I mentioned sort of creating studios. So part of it is we look for diversity across those studios, those community, and we define community not as like a geography sometimes, if it's rural and urban, but it's, new immigrant. It's, you look at like the segmentation of the population, which you can do from the data, to ensure that you get a better, clearer picture of like what who are we representing here? And oftentimes in our work, we will, what are the questions that remain, and who haven't we talked to yet? And the beauty of the studios is that you engage the community leaders, but you engage them in a way when they're citizen designers, they're the ones actually going out in the community, leveraging those relationships, the social capital that they have built to be able to bring that voice forward in a way that we can't. Even as a really great designer or ethnographer, you can't leverage those relationships because you're not part of the community. And so part of the value of walking through that design process and not being the sort of gatekeeper is you're able to draw those perspectives that aren't going to show up to the afternoon community meeting, and being really thoughtful about who are those communities based on where the growth is happening, communities that have been where the greatest disparities exist in healthcare, education, etc. So being really thoughtful about engaging those communities and in a way that isn't just this, what's the problem, tell us how we can fix this for you.
Yeah, I wanted to first speak to the collaborative nature of this panel. I really appreciate that. And I'm thinking one of the things that struck me today is someone mentioned that there's this historical divide that's occurred between planning and architecture and public health. And that echoes the siloed nature of healthcare. And I think Mary Jo could certainly speak to that in terms of we have this effort to increase our collaborative collaborative healthcare and to improve interprofessionalism. And so I wanted to hear something about that, about this mirroring that I'm seeing in the work that's happening here and in what's happening. We've got this urgency of needing to change design for healthcare. We know this is needed desperately soon. So what's happening to change this and change it quickly? You talked about CVS and Walgreens and Target.
Yeah, I think part of the problem when we think about collaboration is that it's this really technical thing. It's just getting two groups together. And the problem with that is when you're working from that expertise model, people love the idea of collaboration, but it better be on their terms, right? So, no, that's not how I see collaboration. I see us leading the collaboration, right? So it, oftentimes working in healthcare never really went anywhere. And the only way I've seen it work well is when you ground yourself in those people living it, right? Because the way that lived experience organizes all the different sectors, right? Because no one's just engaging in healthcare, then they move on to the transportation system, and then they move on to the education system. Like all of that interacts with one another in a sort of complete experience. And so by grounding in the lived experience, no longer is a sort of expert sort of driver relevant there. They're all sort of part of an ecosystem. And so exposing that ecosystem from that perspective tends to, I think, be a much more ripe place to discuss collaboration and think about collaboration than this sort of professional academic activity.
I guess the one piece that I'll kind of add to the great question that you asked is just like you identified, we're going into professionalism is huge, and so we're recognizing that people's problems are too complex, just like cities' problems are too complex for one profession to have the answer. And so that's why interprofessionalism is so large, that we actually need the diabetes educator, we need the health coach, we need the nurse practitioner, we need the physician. So we're going to much more of a kind of a team-based model. But I think you spoke, Kristen, to the fact that one of the most important things we have to see is the interconnections. And so at the Center for Spirituality and Healing, we talk a lot about whole systems thinking and whole systems leadership, and how do we really train people to be whole systems leaders. And I think when we do that, we recognize that it's not even just becoming interprofessional within healthcare, because the well-being of people is so connected by the housing and the education and the transportation and sort of the jobs and sort of all of those spaces. So it's almost like we need studios all over the place to kind of be bringing those diverse perspectives together to advance and create solutions. So another thing we talk a lot about at the center is well-being leadership. And so we have a whole initiative on well-being leadership. And to become a leader in well-being, you have to not only understand your own well-being, everybody affects your own well-being, but appreciate the importance of the well-being of others. And then to understand what are the strategies, the system strategies you can put in place to advance organizational well-being or community well-being. So I think there's so much we can do in that whole leadership space.
I'm just so all over this conversation. It just ties together so many threads for me. One of the things that I liked seeing between commonality between some of your comments was the idea of that design thinking. And as a person, and I loved your reframing for me of studio experience because I thought it was exercise in sleep deprivation. Right?
That's a side effect.
Yeah, side effect or pulling pieces of old filters off your ears. From sleeping unconscious. But the idea of that design thinking and bringing people into how we're designing systems and infrastructure, and the more that I work in the built environment, I see that the less my work seems to matter in a way because it's such a blend of thinking about people and thinking about how we interact with our systems and spaces. And I find as a professional throughout a long career that has been a very difficult space to be in. It is not very well supported. And how we can look at bringing that design perspective into considering the needs of actual humans. And I like the idea of we can't do change until we start to live in space. And I'll just throw out that one interesting thing that lately is discussion of walkability as an economic, sort of social and spatial reframing. That if you look at making walks useful, interesting, comfortable, and safe, that if people can move around that way, that our communities would be vastly different. They really would be vastly different, and would be much more useful as well. And then connecting those places that are walkable to other places in an efficient way that allows you to walk from each location that you're in. And then how do we do that in an actual implementation, or a way that can be implemented across our communities? Because I don't see the planning profession sometimes providing a way to do that. Like, how do you actually start? Where do you start in a real place?
Yeah.
With a real building, a real neighborhood? How do you do that?
Well, I think that's part of design too, is you just start somewhere really small, really safe, and garner that feedback. That's the prototyping piece. In studio, right, you just sort of don't know exactly where you're heading with something, and a lot of times it's headed in the wrong direction. You heard about it when you ended up in your faculty would send you in a new direction. But that's where I think design is really unique, the design process, because too often it's this, again, this sort of expertise linear process of I'm going to make a plan, I'm going to execute that plan, and I'm going to have a solution, and oftentimes the solution is mine, right? In design, you learn really quickly to separate yourself from your work, because otherwise it felt like you were under attack, right? And it's difficult for a lot of folks, right, to have that humility to sort of ask questions as you're going, right? To pose challenges and ideas as you're going, and when they're not necessarily fully developed. But that's the only way you can sort of emerge. Like the only safe way to navigate the unknown, which is what we're talking about, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't be talking about any of these problems that you solved, is that iterative, like learning your way forward into that space. And that's something I think is valuable to any profession, and is why we're working in the School of Public Health to bring that a new minor to public health professionals, so that they have that competency as well.
So something else's work that I think you would be intrigued by is Otto Scharmer from MIT. And Otto Scharmer wrote the book Fear You. And in Otto Scharmer's work, he completely embeds design thinking. And so as you kind of go down the U, the concept is deeply listening, coming to sort of a sense of, a sensing of what it might emerge, and then co-creating, doing lots of prototyping, and then essentially facilitating the emergence of the future. And we're going to actually be bringing them next November to campus for both a Wellbeing lecture and then a full-day workshop. And he does workshops, for these essentially day-long studios for people all around the world. And one of the biggest shifts he talks about that I think kind of caps a lot of the conversation we've had today is in our planning, how do we shift from ecosystem to ecosystem? And so like in all the micro and macro decisions we make, how do we shift from that ego to that eco perspective?
Excuse me, did you say ego system to eco?
So instead of focusing on, it's a shift from me to
Me
we.
too. And actually, that would be a question I'm kind of curious about your view, is it seems like a really natural intersection in terms of alliance with other areas of design would be, it seems a really beautiful connection between regenerative and sustainable design goals of getting off fossil fuel, reducing carbon, etc., and ecological, or health and well-being, not only from an anthropocentric, but also a much larger ecological perspective. And so I'm kind of curious if any of you have thoughts about those, because the efforts that are maybe more framed through, resource consumption and reducing energy, if we flip that, really have fabulous benefits for health and well-being, connecting with passive systems. I work at the building scale, but I'm really wondering, do any of you see those alliances emerging, where you're leveraging both the health and well-being of humans and then other living beings?
And, one of the things we have not talked at all about is green infrastructure. And that is an excellent example of how you can sort of merge, you can solve so many of our ills at this point. You can, doing really good stormwater design, for example, by designing streets that take runoff from the streets into places with trees. So you have this visibility of nature, you have shade from extreme heat events, you have the water being cleaned as it filters through. There's all of these things that we can do that have these multiple implications. And I think green infrastructure is a really good example of using those concepts that we see in nature and then just kind of mimicking them within those ecosystem services that are there that also not just benefit sort of our environment, like clean the air with trees or help filter water, but also are really good for us. We like trees. They're good for our mental health. So there's a whole bunch of things that we really haven't talked much about that can really get at those intersections of health, well-being, city design, and climate change. So I just think there's just a lot out there.
I think climate change is probably the biggest one, because we know the impact of a growing, and it's, again, it disproportionately impacts the most susceptible. So there's sort of the design implications of trying to slow down climate change, as well as being able to mitigate its impacts, right? When people can't be sleeping outside, let's get people low, and now it's going to rain on Saturday, right? It's sort of the both end of the resilience design of, okay, we're going to have to adapt to this to some degree, but then also, the biggest health concern that we sort of wipe ourselves off the face of the earth, right? Because it becomes inhabitable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to dive a little bit into the security topic here. That's where in transit in our work we find when we do community engagement on security, the input we get in those conversations are so varied and often really opposed. Some of our customers might feel safe because it's the one warm spot to be in a transit center to stay warm because they have nowhere else to go. And another customer will say, I don't feel safe because someone is taking shelter here. So could you talk about either some tools or examples in our community or some authors who really can help us think about designing for security, whatever that means, to so many varied communities?
It's kind of a dilemma, right? It's also a dilemma in terms of do you want to have surveillance to enhance security or too much surveillance is actually could be harmful to security, right? And I think one of the issues that we will be facing, I think, in U.S. and also beyond, in other parts of the world, is that what kind of a community we are building, right? So if you think about, I think that you are referring to the homelessness issue, right? And also the intersection between homeless and public transportation. And actually, I have a student at Leoma working on the specific topic is that, why homeless people want to be at those locations. Public transportation, it provides warmth. It also provides them a place to encounter and exchange. And they're out, as a society, everybody is entitled to places of encounter and exchange, right? So that's a public right. So I think, we have to think about, public transportation. Yes, it's about transportation, but it's also public. It's a public space, and we also a mobile public space as well. And how our public space can be inclusive, okay? And and I feel like it's kind of also requires not only physical change, but also the public education can be kind of, I think that is also necessary.
This is the sort of ecosystem view that, in that work you're identifying an issue that isn't necessarily about transportation, okay? And it's the same with like mental illness and policing. Okay? Like it's actually a health and healthcare concern, but the public safety is the one sort of dealing with that, really ill-suited to deal with that. And so that's again the need for the ecosystem design, because otherwise we just sort of stay in these silos, right? Where actually we're trying to address issues that have such broad implications, and then also it's likely, so Tom's working with Hennepin County on housing, chronically homeless that are showing up to Hennepin Healthcare or Hennepin Health constantly, right? Because there's sort of the double win that you're going to reduce costs drastically by just being able to address the issue here, which isn't, I have this medical event. The medical events are because you don't have housing. And in fact, there's research that shows, just giving people a set of keys to an apartment has far greater savings than trying to deal with them in the healthcare system. So this is you need to have that view, otherwise we just keep spinning and try to sort of apply tools that aren't, it's the reframing of the problem, right?
And it's not just a quote-unquote problem. I think one of the issues here is that society is willing to pay for certain things, right, and it's not willing to pay for other things. And that's really what it comes down to. So people that are homeless are forced into certain places because that's where it's warm or that's where it's safe, because we're unwilling to make the investments to have stable housing or to do some of these other things that are really important. And so I think, there's so much we can control of how we design things. There's this whole other level of policy making and where we spend our money to where we put our money that's really critical to solving these issues. It's not just design, it's also about how do we influence those policies so that we can have a better, fairer, more just and healthy society. And that's something where we all need to participate in those decisions, so we make good decisions and put money where our mouth is, rather than saying, they can just find a space somewhere to be okay. But that's not okay. So, these are sort of larger societal problems.
We have time probably for one more question.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming and speaking to us. I'm thinking now about communities, rural communities, small towns, excerpts, or just any cities with major budget deficits who don't have the money to do major infrastructural changes or collaborate here and collaborate there, and they have limited staff capacity. Do you have any thoughts on communities like those, or anecdotes about great examples that we've seen of a community like that addressing health?
So I think they're probably best suited for better design because, so I spent half of my life in a very small rural town. And we did a project recently with Northling Foundation, and part of the problem is these communities are aging, they have brain drain, fewer resources, and as people are aging, part of the challenge is just, well, we need more transportation because we have to get 85-year-old Martha to her doctor's appointments because she lives on a 3-acre farm 30 minutes from town. And by reframing the problem, right, because we're not going to have more resources, in fact, we're likely to have less, what is the real problem there? And we got to a point where, okay, what we're really talking about here is she sees this as home. So how do we better reflect and have that conversation? So the team came up with almost an advanced care plan, like you have in healthcare. Like if this happens, I want this for home. So what makes it home? Because we need to facilitate that in a different way because the 3-acre farm 30 miles from town just isn't feasible anymore, right? And so rethinking that we just need more transportation, more housing, more, and rethinking how we become better utilizers of what is available, the assets that these communities do have. And so that's sort of a small example, but I think engaging rural communities is so important because they're at a point that they're having to deal with big problems with less, and can be really sort of the positive deviance model that partnering with urban communities to be able to learn from what's already happening there and think about how do you amp up the assets and the good rather than keep this deficit view of like we're losing, we need more. That's just never going to happen. So what are the assets you can sort of amplify and or repurpose?
So a quick example I can share with you that doesn't come from the United States, but it's rural, and that is in the Netherlands. It's called the Buurtzorg, B-U-U-R-T-Z-O-R-G, and it's neighborhood nursing. And they really, nurses can manage a very high percent of people's healthcare needs. And the system that had evolved in the Netherlands, like in the United States, is even if somebody is facing their home, it's crazy making. Somebody comes in to do wound care, somebody else to change the IV, somebody else to do this. And they said that is crazy. We're going to develop this concept of neighborhood nursing. And we're going to have two rules that kind of drive this. And one is, don't do useless things. And the other is to keep it simple. And truly, Joost de Blok, who's the kind of the architect of Buurtzorg, it's fascinating the success they've had. They've had huge impact on positive health outcomes. And the Buurtzorg nurses not only provide the care in the home, they actually they can access budget and money to create community events that will drive health and well-being. And so, I've actually been over there and observed the model and seen things that they do for young mothers, things that they do that they have a race for elderly in walkers. I mean, just like amazing out-of-the-box, kinds of ideas. And it's a very much of a whole systems approach. And so I've written one paper that kind of describes the Buurtzorg model, and I think there's a lot of design lessons to learn from them.
Awesome. Well, that concludes our program today. Thank you all for coming. We really hope you enjoyed this event. As a reminder, if you do want to get CN credits, you must fill out an evaluation form, which is on your table. Once you're done filling those out, you can just leave them on the table, make sure it has your name on it, and then we'll get that figured out. Stay on the lookout for emails from us about the recording of this event. We'll send a link out to that as soon as possible, as well as information about our next and final Building Health event in the series, which will take place in April at North Market. And so thank you again for coming. If you want some more food, please take some on your way out. We have a good rest of your day.